The shrapnel fragments on my desk caught the morning light at exactly 7:15 a.m. 3 jagged pieces of Vietnamese steel, each no bigger than a fingernail, encased in crystal alongside my father's Purple Heart. Sergeant Michael Novak had carried those fragments in his legs for 40 years. Every step he took reminded him that someone, somewhere, had decided adequate armor was good enough. I touched the display case the same way I did every morning before reviewing the latest AEGIS test results. 847 ballistic tests, 0 penetration failures, 60% weight reduction compared to traditional steel plating. The molecular structure I'd developed didn't just stop projectiles. It channeled explosive energy away from vehicle occupants through microscopic crystalline patterns that took me 12 years to perfect. Preston Caldwell walked into the demonstration room at Fort Benning trailing cologne that probably cost more than a private's monthly salary. His Armani suit looked ridiculous next to the combat uniforms of the Army and Marine Corps officials assembled for our joint vehicle protection review. He kept checking his Rolex, as if military procurement operated on Manhattan investment banking schedules. I stood before the projection screen displaying AEGIS performance metrics, while Preston lounged in his chair, typing on his phone. The generals and colonels leaned forward as I explained how our proprietary Novak sequences created armor that wasn't just lighter and stronger, but fundamentally different at the molecular level. Each manufacturing step required real-time calibration based on microscopic material behavior that standard processes couldn't replicate. Preston stood up halfway through my presentation, that practiced MBA smile spreading across his face. He picked up my father's memorial from the demonstration table, turning it over in his manicured hands like it was a paperweight from a corporate gift shop. "This is charming, Catherine, really. But I think we need to address the elephant in the room." He held up the shrapnel display for everyone to see. "This emotional attachment to outdated warfare is exactly what's driving our cost overruns. Vietnam-era thinking has no place in modern defense contracting." The room went silent. A Marine colonel's jaw tightened. An Army general shifted uncomfortably. Preston continued, warming to his theme. "These museum pieces represent the past. What our military partners need is adequate protection at reasonable cost, not gold-plated paranoia based on 40-year-old injuries. We're not building luxury vehicles here. We're delivering practical solutions that balance protection with fiscal responsibility." He set my father's memorial down with deliberate carelessness, the crystal case making a sharp crack against the metal table. "Your father's sacrifice was noble, Catherine, but letting emotional thinking cloud rational business judgment endangers more soldiers than it protects. We can deliver adequate armor at half the cost using standard manufacturing processes." I watched him pace the room like a motivational speaker, hands gesturing at invisible profit margins. The temperature in my chest dropped to absolute zero. Not anger, something colder, more patient. "Effective immediately," Preston announced to the assembled officers, "I'm restructuring our armor division to focus on manufacturing efficiency opportunities. Catherine's gold-plated engineering approach wastes taxpayer money that could protect twice as many vehicles with adequate materials." He turned to me with that shark smile. "Catherine, your services are no longer required at Titan Defense Systems. Please collect your personal items, including these." He waved dismissively at my father's shrapnel sentimental museum pieces. The dismissal letter was already printed, sitting on the demonstration table next to 847 successful ballistic test results. Preston had planned this public execution before I'd even started speaking. The military officials looked uncomfortable, but contract negotiations weren't their domain. They needed armor, and Preston controlled the $4.2 billion contract to provide it. I picked up my father's memorial, running my thumb across the crystal surface. The shrapnel caught the light differently now, like it was waiting for something, like it knew something Preston didn't. "Of course, mister." "Caldwell," I said, my voice steady as tungsten carbide. "I'll remove all my materials from Titan Systems immediately." Preston's smile widened. He thought he'd won. My home laboratory occupied the entire basement of the house I'd bought with my first AEGIS patent royalties. The walls were lined with metallurgical equipment that most universities couldn't afford. temperature-controlled furnaces capable of reaching 4,000 degrees Celsius, pressure chambers that could simulate explosive impacts, electron microscopes that revealed molecular structures in crystalline detail. I set my father's memorial in its place of honor, then opened my laptop. The first email went to the patent office, invoking my rights as primary technical authority under the licensing agreements Titan had signed 5 years ago. My patents didn't just cover the AEGIS design, they designated me as the sole authorized entity to approve manufacturing processes. Without my technical authorization, any attempt to produce AEGIS armor violated federal patent law. The second email went to Titan's production database. I removed my access credentials and transferred all proprietary calibration sequences to encrypted personal storage. The Novak sequences weren't just procedures, they were a symphony of temperature, pressure, and timing adjustments that had to be made in real time based on how the metal behaved at the molecular level. I could read those behaviors like other people read facial expressions. Preston's manufacturing team had the documented specifications, of course: temperature ranges, pressure requirements, material compositions. What they didn't have were the 1,700 micro-adjustments I made during each production run, calibrations based on crystalline formation patterns invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 12 years learning to recognize them. I pulled up the production schedules on Titan's internal network one last time. Preston had already accelerated manufacturing, promising the Pentagon delivery of 500 AEGIS-equipped vehicles within 6 months. His lean manufacturing principles would eliminate what he called unnecessary complexity in the production process. I closed the laptop and walked to my testing chamber. Inside sat a sample of armor manufactured without the Novak sequences, something I'd created 3 years ago during patent protection planning. To the naked eye, it looked identical to true AEGIS armor. Under the microscope, the molecular structure was chaos. Crystalline patterns that should channel explosive energy instead created stress points that would shatter under ballistic impact. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues at Titan. Preston had brought in his own manufacturing team, efficiency experts who specialized in cost optimization strategies. They were already revising production protocols to eliminate what they called redundant quality control steps. I didn't respond. Instead, I established Novak Defense Consulting, LLC, specializing in advanced metallurgy for military applications. My first client consultation was already scheduled with Raytheon, who'd been trying to poach me for years. But I wasn't interested in creating new armor systems. Not yet. I was waiting. The metallurgical principles Preston dismissed as gold-plated engineering weren't preferences or perfectionism. They were physics, immutable laws of molecular behavior that didn't care about quarterly earnings or manufacturing efficiency. Every time his team skipped a microcalibration, every time they optimized a process to save time, they created weakness in the armor's crystalline structure. 3 weeks passed. I spent them in my laboratory, refining a new ceramic composite that made AEGIS look primitive. The patent applications were already filed, but I also monitored Titan's production reports through industry contacts. Preston's team was ahead of schedule, celebrating their improved manufacturing velocity. They'd eliminated 70% of my quality control steps. They'd standardized the temperature sequences. They'd automated the pressure calibrations. They'd transformed my molecular symphony into a production line march. The first batch of Preston's adequate armor was already being installed in prototype vehicles. The Army's ballistic testing was scheduled for next month at Aberdeen Proving Ground. Preston had invited Congressional Oversight Committee members to witness what he called the future of efficient defense manufacturing. I marked the date in my calendar, then returned to my microscope. The ceramic composite sample gleamed under magnification, its molecular structure perfect as a snowflake. But my attention kept drifting to the corner of my vision, where my father's shrapnel caught the laboratory lights. "Adequate," I whispered to the empty room. Preston thought adequate was enough when soldiers' lives hung in the balance. He was about to learn that in combat, adequate was another word for catastrophe. The first quality control report arrived on a Tuesday. One of my former colleagues, Dr. Sarah Chen, sent it through encrypted channels. She was one of the few materials scientists Preston hadn't fired in his efficiency purge, kept on because even he recognized they needed someone who understood basic metallurgy. "Catherine, the molecular structure is wrong," her message read. "The crystalline patterns aren't forming correctly. I've flagged it for Preston, but his manufacturing director says the variations are within acceptable tolerance ranges." Acceptable tolerance. In consumer electronics, that meant your phone might freeze occasionally. In military armor, it meant someone's child might not come home. I pulled up the test data Sarah had attached. The microscopic images showed exactly what I'd expected. Without the Novak sequences, the metal was forming irregular crystalline patterns. To Preston's efficiency experts, these looked like minor variations. To anyone who understood materials science, they were structural failures waiting for the right amount of pressure. The second report came 3 days later. Initial stress testing at Titan's facility showed inconsistencies in impact absorption. Preston's team had classified these as statistical outliers and approved the batch for delivery. I started a new notebook, documenting each failure as it occurred, not for legal purposes, for the families who deserved to know that their loved one's protection had been compromised by a man who thought my father's shrapnel was a museum piece. The Aberdeen Proving Ground testing was scheduled for Thursday, October 12th at 0900 hours. I arrived at 0830, taking a seat in the observation bunker among DoD officials, congressional staffers, and defense journalists. Preston stood at the front, his presentation slides ready, that same MBA smile plastered across his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today you'll witness the future of military vehicle protection. Through innovative manufacturing efficiency, we've reduced production costs by 60% while maintaining adequate protective capabilities. Maintaining adequate protective capabilities." He'd taken my life's work and reduced it to a buzzword. The first test used small arms fire. The armor held, though high-speed cameras revealed stress patterns that shouldn't exist. Preston's team called it a complete success. The second test moved to 50 caliber rounds. Still holding, but the stress patterns were spreading. Then came the armor-piercing rounds. The first shot punched through the AEGIS armor like it was aluminum foil. The second created a hole large enough to put your fist through. By the fifth shot, the entire armor panel had collapsed into twisted metal that looked nothing like the molecular masterpiece I'd created. The observation bunker erupted. Military officials demanded explanations. Congressional staffers frantically typed on their phones. Preston's face had gone the color of printer paper. "Technical glitch," he stammered. "Temporary manufacturing anomaly. We'll recalibrate and—" General Morrison, the Army's head of vehicle procurement, stood up. "Mr. Caldwell, that armor just showed a 340% increase in vulnerability compared to our existing systems. You're proposing to put our soldiers in vehicles with less protection than they currently have." The testing continued despite Preston's protests. Each vehicle failed catastrophically. Armor-piercing rounds that true AEGIS would have deflected effortlessly tore through Preston's adequate protection like tissue paper. The high-speed cameras captured every failure in devastating detail. By noon, the Department of Defense had suspended Titan's contract. By 3 p.m., a congressional investigation had been launched. By evening, military family advocacy groups were demanding answers about the substandard protection being offered to their service members. I drove home in silence, my father's memorial sitting on the passenger seat. 40 years he'd lived with shrapnel in his legs because someone had decided adequate armor was sufficient. Now Preston was about to learn what happened when you confused cost optimization with combat reality. My phone had 37 missed calls from Preston by the time I reached my laboratory. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I pulled up the molecular structure diagrams of properly manufactured AEGIS armor, the ones showing the perfect crystalline patterns that channeled explosive energy away from vehicle occupants. Preston would come to me eventually. Men like him always did when their PowerPoint solutions collided with physics. He'd demand I fix his disaster, probably threaten me with lawsuits or claims of sabotage. I looked at my father's shrapnel, then at the diagrams of armor that would have saved him from 40 years of pain. Preston had called his sacrifice emotional thinking. He'd dismissed my father's wounds as outdated warfare, Tomorrow or the next day, Preston would stand in my laboratory, demanding answers he wasn't equipped to understand, and I would explain, with the patience of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, exactly how his adequate protection had failed. Not because I'd sabotaged anything, but because he'd tried to optimize away the laws of physics. The ceramic composite sample gleamed under my microscope, its structure more perfect than anything AEGIS had achieved. I already had patents filed, contracts lined up with competitors. But first, Preston needed to understand the cost of dismissing expertise, of reducing everything to profit margins, of calling my father's sacrifice a museum piece. The phone rang again. Preston's number. This time I smiled. Preston arrived at my laboratory on a Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the Aberdeen disaster. He didn't knock. Just pounded on the door until I opened it, his Armani suit wrinkled, his perfect executive hair disheveled. The cologne was gone, replaced by the sharp smell of desperation. "You sabotaged the armor," he snarled, pushing past me into the laboratory. "You deliberately destroyed my company to satisfy your petty revenge fantasy." I closed the door calmly and walked to my electron microscope. "Actually, Preston, I did nothing." "That's precisely the problem. I did absolutely nothing to your manufacturing process. Don't play games with me, Catherine. The Pentagon is threatening criminal charges. Congressional committees are demanding my head. Fix this, now." I pulled up 2 images on the laboratory monitors. The first showed AEGIS armor manufactured with the Novak sequences, its crystalline structure resembling an intricate lattice of interwoven patterns. The second showed Preston's adequate protection, a chaotic mess of malformed crystals and stress fractures. "This is what proper AEGIS armor looks like at the molecular level," I explained, my voice taking on the patient tone I used with first-year materials science students. "Notice the uniform crystalline patterns. Each one channels kinetic energy away from the point of impact, distributing force across the entire panel. It requires 1,700 micro-adjustments during manufacturing, calibrations based on real-time observation of molecular behavior." Preston stared at the screens, his mouth working soundlessly. "And this," I continued, pointing to the second image, "is what happens when you eliminate those adjustments in the name of efficiency. The crystals form incorrectly. Instead of channeling energy, they create stress points. Under ballistic impact, these stress points become failure cascades. Your adequate armor isn't just weaker than AEGIS, it's weaker than conventional steel plating." "You could have told me," he whispered. "I did tell you, in every technical briefing you didn't attend. In every quality control report you dismissed as gold-plated engineering, in every warning about the complexity of metallurgical processes that you reduced to manufacturing efficiency opportunities." I walked to my father's memorial, picking it up carefully. "But you weren't interested in technical details. You were too busy examining this, calling it a museum piece, dismissing it as emotional thinking that clouded rational business judgment." Preston's face had gone pale. "That's what this is about? Your father's old injury?" I set the memorial down and turned to face him fully. My father lived with shrapnel in his legs for 40 years because someone, somewhere, decided that adequate armor was sufficient. Every step he took reminded him that cost optimization had been more important than soldier protection. You called his sacrifice outdated warfare thinking, but those metal fragments taught me something you'll never comprehend. I pulled up the Aberdeen test footage on the main screen, the high-speed cameras showing Preston's armor failing catastrophically. When soldiers' lives depend on your work, adequate is another word for homicide. You fired me because you thought emotional attachment to my father's sacrifice was clouding my judgment. But it wasn't emotion that created AEGIS. It was the determination to ensure no other child would watch their parent suffer because a contractor chose reasonable cost over impenetrable protection. The footage played in slow motion, armor-piercing rounds tearing through the panels like they weren't even there. My father's shrapnel isn't a museum piece, Preston. It's a warning, a reminder that when you optimize away excellence in favor of adequacy, real people bleed, real families suffer, real soldiers die. Preston sank into a laboratory chair, his executive presence completely deflated. The government wants you to fix this. They'll reinstate the contract if you come back. I laughed, sharp and cold. The government doesn't want me to fix your disaster, Preston. They want me to replace you. The Pentagon has already offered me Director of Military Vehicle Protection Standards. I'll have technical authority over every defense contractor in the country. Your replacement at Titan will report to me. His head snapped up. You planned this. No, Preston. You planned this the moment you decided that materials science was just another business process to optimize. I simply understood physics better than you understood PowerPoint. I opened my laptop and showed him the congressional subpoena with his name on it. You're going to testify before the Armed Services Committee about how you endangered American soldiers to improve your profit margins. You'll explain how you ignored technical warnings to pursue manufacturing efficiency. And you'll live with the knowledge that your adequate protection could have killed someone's father, someone's child, someone's spouse. Preston stood up slowly, all his corporate arrogance drained away. You've destroyed me. No, I corrected. You destroyed yourself. I just refused to save you from physics. The Pentagon appointment ceremony took place 6 months later in the same room where Preston had fired me. The walls were now lined with photographs of soldiers whose lives had been saved by properly manufactured AEGIS armor. General Morrison pinned the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service to my jacket, while Preston's former colleagues applauded. My new office overlooked the Potomac, its walls dedicated to a memorial I'd personally designed. At the center sat my father's shrapnel in its crystal case, but now it was surrounded by letters from military families thanking me for ensuring their loved ones came home. Each letter represented a life that Preston's adequate protection would have endangered. The wall behind my desk displayed the new manufacturing standards I'd implemented. Every defense contractor now had to meet the Novak protocols, quality control measures that made cost optimization secondary to soldier survival. Any deviation required my personal approval. Any failure meant immediate contract termination. Sarah Chen, who I'd hired as my deputy director, knocked on the door. "Catherine, you need to see this." She handed me a tablet showing a news article. Preston Caldwell had taken a position teaching introductory manufacturing at Northern Virginia Community College. The accompanying photo showed him in a cramped classroom using calipers to measure basic steel samples, manual measurement of metal thickness, the exact primitive analysis that AEGIS had been designed to transcend. I set the tablet down and turned to the window. Somewhere in that community college, Preston was teaching students that adequate materials were acceptable for basic applications. He was probably using terms like cost-effectiveness and manufacturing efficiency, but he was doing it while manually measuring metal with tools that belonged in a museum, reduced to the very simplistic engineering approaches he'd once believed sufficient for protecting American soldiers. The irony wasn't lost on me. Preston, who had reduced everything to profit margins and cost per unit calculations, now spent his days with calipers and rulers, teaching students to measure what they could see while remaining blind to what truly mattered at the molecular level. My father visited the office that afternoon, walking without the limp that had defined my childhood. The new treatment I'd funded with my Pentagon salary had finally removed the remaining shrapnel fragments. 43 years after Vietnam, the metal was gone. He stood beside me at the memorial wall, reading the letters from grateful families. His hand found mine, weathered fingers still strong. "You did it, Katie," he said quietly. "You made sure no one else has to carry what I carried." I looked at the shrapnel in its case, those 3 jagged pieces that had driven me to master materials science, to create armor that made such wounds impossible. Preston had called them museum pieces, but they were more than that. They were the foundation of every life saved, every soldier protected, every family kept whole. That evening, I received an email from Preston. A single line. "I understand now." I deleted it without responding. Understanding meant nothing after the fact. My father had understood the cost of adequate protection every day for 40 years. The families of soldiers understood when their loved ones came home safe. I understood when I transformed inherited trauma into impenetrable protection. Preston understood only after his arrogance had collapsed, after his cost optimization had failed, after he'd been reduced to teaching basic measurements in a community college classroom. He understood now that adequate was never enough when lives hung in the balance, that expertise couldn't be optimized away, that some things couldn't be reduced to profit margins. I closed my laptop and picked up my father's memorial one last time before leaving the office. The shrapnel caught the setting sun through the window, casting shadows that looked like the molecular structures of properly manufactured armor, perfect crystalline patterns that channeled danger away from the vulnerable. Tomorrow, I would review new armor developments from a dozen contractors, each one knowing that their work would be measured against the Novak protocols, each one understanding that adequate would never be acceptable, that cost optimization would never outweigh soldier protection, that someone who understood materials science at the molecular level would evaluate every single component. But tonight, I would go home to my laboratory and continue developing the ceramic composite that would make even AEGIS obsolete, because my father's shrapnel had taught me something Preston never understood. When you carry the weight of other people's protection, perfection isn't an aspiration, it's an obligation.